Mr. Chancellor, Madame Provost, distinguished guests, fellow students, family members, and friends. It's such a thrill and honor to share this day with you, which also happens to be National Aboriginal Day. In addition to acknowledging the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, Seneca, and Haudenosaunee, I would also like to acknowledge the Indigenous elders and traditional knowledge keepers who are present here at Convocation. Thank you for sharing this important day with us. I would like to acknowledge my wife, Amira, a graduate of the University of Toronto, and my father, Leslie Dan, 90 years old, and a triple graduate of the University of Toronto. Like many families here, we have U of T in our DNA. Finally, I would like to acknowledge and thank all the members of the U of T community, too numerous to mention, who are working to bring about reconciliation and build a nation-to-nation relationship. One of the most difficult questions I get asked at cocktail parties is, what do you do? After a moment of stony silence, I usually begin by talking about the things that I have done, including neurosurgery, a PhD in experimental medicine, an MBA, and managing a public biotech company, all accomplished before the age of 35. But answering the question of what do you do with what you have done is a form of evasion. Following the sale of our family business in 2000, I began searching for a new direction in life. As Dante Alighieri famously wrote, "Midway upon the journey of our life, I found myself within a forest dark, for the straightforward path had been lost." Eventually, I concluded that I could have a greater impact in the world if I dropped the biomedical career and focused instead on philanthropy. But instead of following a predefined formula, I allowed time for the philanthropic path to reveal itself to me. With the redistribution of our family assets in 2003, my brother Aubrey and I became the owners of 4 hydroelectric stations in Northern Ontario. These were originally purchased by our father in the early 1990s. In 2006, we sold off the hydro stations for a handsome profit. Soon afterwards, I realized this was a mistake and that we had just sold 4 ATM machines. The lesson here is to never underestimate the value of something that your family has carefully and meticulously built for you over many years. Family wealth isn't always about material wealth. Oftentimes, the only wealth you will ever inherit from your family are stories lovingly passed down over the generations, or a good work ethic, or a reputation for honesty. And these are more precious than any material asset you will ever own. Determined to rebuild my hydro portfolio, I quickly learned that all the undeveloped hydro sites in Ontario are in remote areas, typically in the traditional territory of some desperately poor First Nation. Growing up in Don Mills in the 1960s, I learned very little about First Nations, so to visit an Indian reserve and to hang out with real Indians and to participate in their powwows and be invited to their ceremonies was an eye-opening, transformative experience for which I'm eternally grateful. The intersection of medicine and the social sciences is called public health, a subject which nearly bored me to tears as an undergraduate medical student, but which greatly interests me today, now that I've matured somewhat. After many visits to Indian reserves in northwestern Ontario, under the pretext of looking for hydro sites, I slowly started to see the lives of Indigenous people through a public health lens. And this, in turn, has helped me to see Canada through an Indigenous lens. For 95% of the population, Canada is simply the best country in the world. We have the highest proportion of university graduates. Our middle class is strong. Our quality of life is exceeded by none. We are a happy people. For the 5% who are Indigenous, Canada is a paternalistic, bureaucratic, and autocratic state that offers no easy path to prosperity. For First Nations living on reserve, all the social determinants of health, housing, food security, water quality, education, employment, are controlled by the federal government via the Indian Act, This is the same federal government that funds Indigenous scholars who must rely on government statistics when studying the health of their own communities. There's an obvious conflict of interest here. Indigenous children experience poverty, homelessness, food insecurity, and the child welfare system far more frequently than non-Indigenous children. 90% of the children in foster care in Manitoba are First Nations. First Nations make up 25% of the federal prison population. First Nations suffer from mental illness, chronic diseases, and trauma at much higher rates than the Canadian average, and they die 7 years earlier than the Canadian average. In northern Saskatchewan, the HIV rate among First Nations is at third world levels. The Inuit have a rate of tuberculosis that is over 300 times the Canadian-born non-Indigenous rate, and they die some 15 earlier than the Canadian average. These are not just appalling statistics, they are human lives destroyed by a colonial system. The good news, if we can call it good news, is that at least a third of Indigenous health issues have systemic causes. This means that they can be improved through systemic change. Systemic racism and power imbalances can be addressed. Primary and preventive health care can be improved. Access to acute care can be improved. Food security and housing can be improved. There's an economic cost to doing all of these things, but there is an even greater cost to not doing them. To quote Pam Palmater, it costs $115,000 per year to keep someone in prison. That's the cost of an undergraduate university degree. End of quote. Indigenous people are the fastest growing demographic in Canada, and improving Indigenous health will benefit the public purse over the long run and even boost the Canadian economy. So what part of saving money do our politicians not understand? Reconciliation between the Crown and Indigenous peoples is now firmly underway, but it will take many generations to achieve. You, class of 2018, need to get involved, and so will your kids. Reconciliation is both a journey and a destination. The final goal is a mutually satisfactory nation-to-nation relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people based on mutual respect and reciprocity. This is something that should have happened 150 years ago but didn't, so now we've got to fix it. And we will know that it's fixed when Indigenous kids receive the same health, educational, and vocational opportunities as non-Indigenous kids, when they constitute 5% of our doctors, lawyers, bankers, and politicians. At some point along the way, we will have to abolish that racist piece of legislation called the Indian Act. This is going to be a very messy process, but some people say it can never be done. I say that Canada will never be a post-colonial society as long as the Indian Act is on our books. Every other law in Canada has been designed to create a fair shot at modest prosperity for the average Canadian. The Indian Act has got to go for the simple reason that it will never create an Indigenous middle class. Does the idea of an Indigenous middle class sound strange to you? Perhaps you should ask yourself, why do you feel that way? The first step on the path of reconciliation is for the 95% of Canadians who are non-Indigenous to recognize and acknowledge that they are settlers. It doesn't matter if your ancestors arrived with Jacques Cartier and pulled up tree stumps, or flew in on Air Canada business class last week. To Indigenous eyes, you're still a settler. And whereas settlers gradually become more Canadian with successive generations, Indigenous identity is never outgrown nor shed with the passage of time, but rather grown into and embraced. The lessons of forced assimilation of Indigenous people have been very costly for Canada. It's time to finally let go of the colonial past and to invite Indigenous people into the middle class. So now when people ask me what I do, I no longer evade the question. I tell them that I look at the world through progressive bifocals, which is true. One lens is a settler lens and the other an Indigenous lens. And I see a future in which Indigenous people prosper and flourish much to the benefit of everyone who calls this place home. Thank you, merci, Nyawen, miigwech, and all my relations.